Well, thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Looking forward to, again, having our monthly conversation regarding the progress, or in certain terms, the lack of progress in the legislative situation here in Washington, D.C. Jay is going to start us off with a, I think, fairly complete, let's see, have I got here? Okay, with a fairly complete rundown, here we go, of the situation. We do have legislation that is on the table. And while the focus of that legislation may not be taxes, it is something that you never want to say never in the case of the United States Congress, or else you will be surprised. The one thing I can tell you that is relatively sure, by the way, please note that Amy has just posted the handout link. If there is any question, and of course it just disappeared, but if there's any question about accessing the slides here, please just put something into Q&A if you did not obtain that, or we will have Amy actually replicate that here as we get to the end. With that, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Jay, who's going to lead us through the possible tax legislation this year and begin to touch on next year. I'll come back towards the end of the program and talk about some of the challenges that Congress is going to be facing in years after that. And I think it is not too soon to at least become aware of the situation, the economic situation, the financial situation that we find ourselves in, and how that may impact tax legislation going forward. So with that, Jay, I'm going to turn things over to you, and away we go.
Excellent. So what the big takeaway is what Mel said, what may happen. That's pretty much where we are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the possible bills that could be tax legislation. So they may not be now, but they might be later. And so I'm just going to hit some of the high notes. These are the bills that are hopefully Democrats hope to pass. So there could be other bills down the road that come up and they're a surprise, but these are the ones right now that are currently on the front burner, and they hope that they can get some sort of deal out of these things. So away we go. These are, like I just said, the big ticket items. Now this first one, the semiconductor China trade bill, this is a trade bill. And so it is the House passed a bill called the Competes Act, and the Senate passed a bill called USICA, and they are now trying to combine those bills into a bill that can essentially confront China when it comes to making semiconductors. And one issue here is that there was a trade provision passed in the House bill that could allow other trade provisions to be added to it. And so what's going on now with this bill, it's called the conference. And what that means is that you have senators and Congress people come together and try to figure out the differences between their bills and make a bill that can pass both chambers. There is over 100 members of Congress on this conference, which is kind of laughable because it's usually like 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 people, but there's 100 people on this thing. And so it makes you think, it makes me think that this is going to be a leadership bill that comes out of this conference and not something that's hashed out with the members of this conference. The next one is Secure 2.0. This is retirement legislation. That's something that might have the best chance of actually passing, but I'll get to that later. And then of course, Build Back Better. Build Back Better, for those who don't understand it, it's got about 1 billion names. This is the reconciliation bill that Democrats want to pass, and they only need Democratic votes to pass it because they're using a budget rule that protects it from filibuster. And so I might say reconciliation, I might say Build Back Better, I might say dead, but that's all the same bill. And then at the end is a year-end tax bill. This is the Hail Mary. If nothing else happens, a year-end tax bill might happen. but we'll just see what goes on from there. Now, here's the thing that's really important about these bills. Passage. How many votes does it take to actually pass? And so when you look on here, all the bills are 60 votes except one, Build Back Better. So the other bills, the China Trade Bill, the Secure Act, and the year-end tax bill, most likely year-end tax bill, will have to have Republican support in the Senate. So when you look at these bills, you can pretty much guess that there's not going to be a tax increase in these bills. The Secure Act does have some tax increases, but they're not considered tax increases. They're, you can change from an IRA to a Roth, and when you do that, you have to pay the tax, and so that's revenue. It's not really considered a tax increase. But so if you look at all these bills, there's only one chance on this, in this world, in the current state, there's only one chance for tax increases to happen, and that's Build Back Better. And I'll talk about what's going on there in a second. So I'm going to do a breakdown of bills, and this is just a really quick overview, but I'm going to give you the takeaway before I start talking about this. There's a group of lawmakers in Congress that do not want business tax breaks to be extended or modified until family tax breaks are extended or modified. And that is keeping nearly all tax provisions off of bills. And so as I speak about this, the argument for every single bill I'm going to bring up is that there's a group of lawmakers saying you cannot extend or modify a business tax break until you modify and extend a family tax break. And this argument has been going on for months, and it's just going to happen. It's just a reality of what's going on. So here we go. This is the semiconductor trade bill, like I told you. Now, one of the things that they're trying to do with this bill in this conference is have a tax credit for semiconductors. And so it would fit within the bill. There is a tax provision in the House bill that could allow it to be added to that. But here's the problem is if you add the tax credit for semiconductors, you're basically opening the gates to everything else. And so someone will say, you need 60 to get this vote to get it out of the Senate. So you could have a group of lawmakers say, hey, if we can do a tax credit for semiconductors, why don't we fix the R&D? Why don't we fix 163J? Why don't we fix LIFO? And then other people say, well, you're doing business tax breaks. You can't do that. First, you have to deal with the child tax credit. You have to deal with the EITC. You have to expand those things. You have to make them bigger. And so it becomes what's called the Christmas tree. And because of that, Christmas tree means it gets so big, it has so many things on it, it implodes on its own weight. And there is, because of the concern of the Christmas tree, the idea that there's going to be a tax title attached to this bill is narrowing, because President Biden really wants this bill to pass, and he really wants to sign it into law. And this is for political reasons as well as economical reasons. So this is Secure 2.0, and this is the House approved its bill back in March, as you can read this. The Senate Finance Committee is going to mark up its bill tomorrow, the 22nd, not the 23rd. They changed that since I made this slide. When I made this slide, there were 1,000 amendments that they were going to deal with. They are now going to deal with, I think, 21 amendments. And so the thought is that they have come together to some agreement on a bipartisan basis. So I know the guys, I know a couple of the guys on the Senate Finance Committee Republican side, and they have said that it looks like they're on board with this bill. So if that happens, this bill could pass, and it could have 60 votes. It could pass through Senate Finance Committee, go to the Senate floor, and pass with 60 votes and be done. Well, almost done. I'll get to that later. But it will not have, this bill will not be a rider for other provisions, like the R&D tax credit or the R&D amortization problem. or the 163J where it's shrunk to what can actually qualify for that, or even LIFO. This will only be retirement measures that are on this bill. And if they open it up, it'll kill the bill. And this is, again, something Democrats want to see passed. So it seems to me that it has the best chance of passing, just because when I talk to the Senate finance staffers, they are talking positively about this to me, and they don't have to. They can just say, this is dead, we're going to keep it forever. But anyway, this markup is tomorrow. It's only supposed to last one day. It could go late, but at the end, there actually could be passage of this bill. And if it passes, it could go to the Senate floor fairly quickly. So this is what passed in the House passed secure bill. So these are just some of the issues that are here, and or some of the provisions. One thing that you could really note from this is the Senate bill has many of these provisions, but if there's any difference, they're going to have to go to conference over these bills. And if they do that, that will take time. So what normally happens, if history is any guide, the House will normally accept what the Senate bill is and just pass it as is, and then it goes to the White House to be voted on or to be signed into law. So I would be looking closer at the provisions in the Senate bill whenever it gets done and whenever it passes the Senate, and keep the House bill on the back burner.
Let me just say something here regarding that, and that is, at this point in time, I guess we are one day in advance of really being able to share with you the details of the Senate version that Jay is referring to. That is something that the firm is following. Jay is going to be, I believe, monitoring the markup all day tomorrow. We have people in the firm who are responsible for employee benefits and responsible for savings assumptions. And so do expect that you will see, I assume you were on the mailing list because you got the notice that this is here. If for any reason you see that it has passed the Senate or even has been reported out of the Senate Finance Committee, please let us know. If you do not receive notice of a summary that the firm will be providing to all of its correspondents. So sorry to interrupt, Jay, but just wanted to drop that fact in there.
Yeah, it's supposed to go late tomorrow night. So like according to the staffers, the earliest will be 8 p.m. when it ends. As I've shared, I don't know on this thing, but I was at a markup. It went to 4:30 in the morning. So I don't know if this is going to go that late or not, but this is not going to happen by noon tomorrow. So no. It's going to be a while.
And if it's marked up, the marked up is not the same thing as past the Senate. Right. The Senate has many rules which allow really one individual senator to delay, to defer. And so consequently, we will not have that kind of certainty if there is going to be certainty for a while. But do note if you do see something come in from Eide Bailey that references Secure 2.0, it potentially does have changes of note to your IRA, to your 401k, and potentially to your arrangement with your employers.
All righty. All right, so moving on. So this is the reconciliation bill. Oh, here comes a polling question, everybody. The thing that is important to note here is that Congress has until September to pass this bill. And so this is what the House passed in November 19th of last year. These are the tax increases, or many of the tax increases that would be a part of that bill. And they have until September. And it's kind of iffy on if they're going to get there or not, but this isn't something that can wait until December. This isn't a year-end tax bill that can happen. If this doesn't happen by September 30th, it is probably dead. But until then, it's hard to know exactly when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen. And so, hang on a second, see if I can get this. There we go. So the Senate, this is the Senate slide. This is what the senators tried to advance a couple weekends ago. And if you look on the right-hand side, it shows just a breakdown of what they were trying to do. What you notice that's not on that list is an expansion of the child tax credit. There is a lawmaker who is against this child tax credit being expanded for two reasons. One being that it adds to inflation, another being that the money from the child tax credit actually goes to people who might use it to buy drugs. I thought that was baloney, but I found out through actually someone from the Obama administration that it's true. And so that's why it's put a pause on the child tax credit to be expanded by more than just the Senator Manchin, who has been the most advocate to say we shouldn't expand this thing. And so it's not on the list, but other senators on the Democratic side were saying, well, we still want it to be on the list. And so this had about a 48-hour period of being a doable bill in the Senate that they could pass ASAP, and it fell apart Saturday, June 5th in the evening. So on June 4th, it looked like, hey, they're going to try to move this ASAP, which, over the weekend kind of thing. And by the next day, it died, largely because the child tax credit was off of it, and some of the Democrats who wanted to vote for the child tax credit said, well, I'm not going to vote for this bill. And so it actually died. The Senate has a lot of things on its plate right now, including the semiconductor bill, the Secure 2.0 bill, gun legislation, just so many other pieces going on right now that it's hard to really know exactly where or when this bill might pass the Senate, and or if it would even be brought up for a vote. So there's a lot of unknowns with this bill on the Senate. So this is the if they were to pass it, what would happen? Well, it's going to be different than what the House passed. The House had a really big bill. This bill is supposed to be much smaller and have a fewer amount of provisions in it. Having said that, though, it would probably have the same amount of tax increases in it, because one thing that the Senate's trying to do is to create a bill that pays for its provisions, but also reduces the deficit. And so you might have $1 trillion tax increase in there that half of it goes to the provisions, half of it goes to deficit reduction. There's a problem with that is because that bill has to be approved by the House. And I've spoken to a couple lawmakers on the Ways and Means Committee who have said, if they don't expand the child tax credit, we don't think it's going to pass the House. Well, there's also other ideas that if the Senate doesn't deal with the SALT cap, which everyone's kind of forgotten about, but that's still an issue for some people in the House. If they haven't done that, that could be a problem as well. And so even if the Senate does pass their bill, and even if the House leadership says, okay, guys, we have to accept this bill as is and get it gone, so then Biden can sign it into law, that's a real unknown thing, because many, many lawmakers are saying, I'm up for re-election, and if this bill passes before the election and I supported it without expanding the child tax credit, without dealing with the SALT cap, as I've promised my voters forever, they're going to be in trouble anyway. And so many people are saying, these lawmakers are saying they've heard that there's a lot of complaints of, don't force me to vote on this bill until after the election. And so we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But the fate of this bill is so messy, it's unbelievable. And the fact that it's been messy for over 6 months is also unbelievable. So the year-end tax bill will be the Hail Mary. if nothing else happens, we're going to have a year-end tax bill. That's just what it is. And the reason why it can happen and get 60 votes is because it will be after the election. And normally after the election, that's when a bipartisan bill has the best opportunity to pass Congress. And so it would include the fix for R&D and 163J and probably LIFO. I don't think I have LIFO on there, but also probably include some of the tax extenders that have already expired. I don't think it would like extend things that are going to expire in 2023. And so this bill will only exist if the other bills fail to pass. And the biggest one would be obviously if Build Back Better doesn't pass, you would expect to see some sort of year-end bill, including at least some of the provisions in that. Now, the big question about a year-end bill is, will it go to deficit reduction or will it not? Well, if it needs 60 votes, it's not going to go to deficit reduction. There's not going to be a tax increase on this bill. I don't think bipartisanship extends that far that Republicans will say, oh, we'll increase taxes right after the election, because that's just a campaign ad set for them against their opposing candidate down the road. So if there's a year-end bill, it's probably going to be tax cuts or expansion of tax cuts and not really tax increases. All right, the clock is ticking. This is why I find it kind of interesting that we're in June, and you would think, okay, well, it's a half year. They've got 6 more years or 6 more months left to do everything. The House and Senate are actually in session for roughly 20 or 40 days together for the rest of the year. And so when you think about them passing legislation, they've got 40 days between now and the end of December that both houses are in session, which is kind of amazing that like they're not really here all that often. And if they're not here all that often, they're focused on something else, which is re-election. And so, you know, as we get closer and closer to September, definitely October, their minds are going to be moving more and more and more toward election. And it's really questionable like when they will actually want to move anything. But here's what's expected. And so the semiconductor China bill, that was supposed to pass by July 4th. That's what the hope is. There's now talk of like, maybe we get an agreement on July 4th, then we write the legislation, and then we vote on it by before August. Secure 2.0 is supposed to be before August. Build Back Better also by August. The year end would be after the election. These deadlines are moving so much to where it's almost confusing about like when reporters talk and they say, so you're looking at a July 4th deadline, the lawmaker has to say, which bill you talking about? Because which one? Because they're moving this, and to be honest, creating deadlines for these bills, it's extremely hard and kind of not really worth trying. So here's just a state of play where things are, and I'll be quick on this because I'm running out of time. The semiconductor bill, they are meeting, lawmakers are meeting on this bill, but the talks are going slow, which is why it went from maybe we get an agreement on July 4th and then pass it before August. Secure 2.0, this is going to be in the Senate Finance Committee markup. Once it gets marked up and passes the Senate Finance Committee, it's going to be added to another bill that passed the Senate Help Committee, Help, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. That has a retirement bill too. Those will be combined, and then both will go to the Senate floor. Again, there has to be at least 10 Republicans to vote for this bill, assuming all Democrats vote for this bill. Build Back Better, there really has been no real progress on this bill. In fact, issues have been added to it more than taken away, because now SALT's coming back with the cap of like, okay, there's no other legislative thing. We have to do it with a Democratic supported bill only because that's the only way it's going to pass. Let's get it on Build Back Better. And so almost it's having more trouble than it did 6 weeks ago. The year-end tax bill, that'll happen once everything's done. And if everything fails to pass, expect a year-end tax bill. And then this is like the long shot thing, but there is talk about adding tax provisions to the spending bill that has to pass before September 30th. To do that, you basically have to add a tax title to a spending bill, and then it has to take 60 to vote, or 60 votes in the Senate to pass. So you're going to have to get 10 Republicans to vote for that bill again. And so are you going to get an expansion of the CTC? Probably not. Are you going to get salt cap repeal? Probably not. So many of the things that are wanted by Democrats, they're going to have to get this through the Senate, which is not going to happen. So it's going to be hard to actually do this. There was one time when it did happen, and it literally was one provision at the end of a bill, and there was no tax title. It just happened. It was just on there. And I highly wonder how many lawmakers knew that there was a tax provision on a spending bill. It was, anyway, but like this could happen, but it's a real long shot.
Jay, if I can interrupt just briefly here.
Yeah.
A question I have had raised to me is, well, if Build Back Better does not appear to have much likelihood of enactment, Build Back Better is the provision that the Democrats were going to use their one shot at passage with under budget reconciliation with a 50 plus the vice president vote. Is there any way in which they could just abandon Build Back Better and shift that to some of the legislation that you've been talking about here, and sort of a final Hail Mary to prove that they can do something in Congress before the election comes about? Or is that something that's just not structurally possible for them?
No, they could. What they could do is they could let Build Back Better die in September, and then come October, do a year-end tax bill under reconciliation rules, but you have to approve a budget before you do that. So there's a lot of logistics, like both houses have to approve the same budget that would agree to say, we can have a reconciliation bill on this. Now you can do that because the budget doesn't go to the president to be signed. It can be a 51 vote situation in the Senate. You can do that, but then you're basically saying to people, before the election, hey, we just totally gave up on this. And so if you're going to put it into the year-end tax bill, what's to change? What's the argument change going to be? Is Manchin suddenly going to say, yes, I'm okay with expanding the child tax credit because now it's in a year-end tax bill and not in the Build Back Better bill? So the arguments are going to be the same. The biggest thing that's kind of funny about the Build Back Better is the arguments haven't changed for months. And I'm not exaggerating, for months, these are the same arguments. So if they get rid of Build Back Better and make it a year-end tax bill, the arguments are still going to be the same. And so how do you change this? So I think people are looking for some sort of just lucky moment when lightning's going to strike and you can able to pass this bill quickly, because that's what they did in June 4th and 5th. They were just they were looking for lightning, just like, let's just do it. And it just didn't. So yes, you could transfer all these to other legislations, but the arguments are going to be the same. And especially in the run up to election, the better part would be wait till after the election and then do a reconciliation bill with the year-end stuff. But you know, these guys don't act that fast when it comes to like doing the budget. So
the harsh breath of reality faces Congress, and I guess you could say faces all. All right. Now, okay, so what if there is no tax legislation in 2020?
Yeah,
2022. What are we looking at, Jay?
All righty. Okay, this is based on the assumption that Republicans take back at least the House. I spoke to Representative Brady, who is the ranking member on Ways and Means Committee, used to be the chairman. And they're going to basically, at the beginning of next year, January, a calendar year, they're going to start, once they get into power, they're going to do a tax bill that will deal with Section 174, Section 163J, the lifeless situation. They're going to deal with all that in a quick bill that can hopefully possibly be retroactive. You don't know yet or not if that's going to happen or not, but they're trying to do that in January. And so it'll be a quick bill. Now, when I say they're going to do it in January, they might introduce in January. I don't know if it's going to go through any sort of process, because if they have the reins, they can just basically make this a leadership bill and pass it. But they're trying to fix basically what the 2017 tax bill did, because these provisions, the 174, 163J stuff, that was never supposed to happen. That when they backdate the executive or the effective date on a provision, it's telling the world this is not supposed to happen. These provisions were not supposed to go into law. And so now they're looking to like undo that. And then after that is when they'll start talking about extending the tax reform bill of 2017. And that might be a very long process. And with that, sir, I hand it to you, big guy.
Okay, well, before we do that, everyone, please note that the second polling question has popped up. Let's go ahead and get everybody signed in here so that we can, and we'll move forward here. I'm gonna get this so I can see what's on the slide. All right, there are other focuses regarding tax other than the passage of legislation. And we have seen certainly with some of the activity that's going on in Congress right now, particularly the report coming from the House. It's not necessarily what is going to happen, but a discussion of what has happened. And many of the Republicans feel that in the last 2 years, lots of questions have been raised about how Republicans have managed affairs of government. There have not been as many questions raised about how Democratic administrations have handled government affairs. And there are a number of Republican members who would feel that it's their turn to take a crack at that. Now, the Internal Revenue Service is always a popular target. And certainly we have gone through a couple of years now where the Internal Revenue Service has had significant problems with just keeping up with the duties that were assigned by Congress. Now, you can certainly argue that more duties were assigned by Congress than they ever had a prayer of keeping up with. But there's no question that there have been, phones have not been answered. Good, when you get someone on the phone, quality advice has not been given. And on a couple of occasions, leaks of data, leaks of taxpayer information, which is, by the way, a felony, have occurred. And so it would not surprise us to see a congressional investigation begin with regard to that. And that is something that is going to potentially divert attention away from tax legislation itself. So even though we have a number of issues on the table, Jay mentions 163J, the change in the interest rules that make it more difficult to deduct what is otherwise ordinary and necessary business interest. The research and development capitalization and amortization rules, certainly an enormous change. Those are all definitely going to be on the table. They are going to be of primary attention, but there are other things that are going to attract attention as well. And these are things that we could see I hate to say gum up the works, but in fact could serve as distractions from what might otherwise be the legislative process. Will that prevent tax legislation in 2023? I would tend to say no, although until we know what the makeup of Congress is going to be, we do, I think, have fairly good indications that the Republicans are expected to control the House of Representatives. The Senate is still somewhat up in the air. If the Senate remains in Democratic or remains in 50-50 hands, then the expectation is that it's going to be very difficult to reach any kind of agreement with the Republican House. and that in fact the 2024 election, campaigning for the 2024 election is going to begin in mid-November of 2022. The issues, even if the Senate were to turn to Republican hands after this year's election, I think there is still some significant question as to whether some of the broad proposals, some of the broad interests that the Republicans are likely to bring to the table in tax could actually be signed by the Democratic president. And given that circumstance, given that reality, and also given the reality of the conflict leading into the presidential election in 2024, if the Republicans control both houses, they have a choice to make. Do we try and craft legislation that the president will sign? In which case we accomplish some of the things that we seek to accomplish. Or do we focus on proposing and presenting legislation that the president will not sign, and use that later as a campaign tool to hopefully put ourselves in a position where we as Republicans would control the presidency, the House, and the Senate in 2024. Okay. That brings us to a discussion of what really is the long-term outlook? What do the current deficit inflation situations mean for the long-term prospects of federal income taxation? And it is going to be a difficult slog. Let's take a look. This is the Congressional Budget Office. Congressional Budget Office regularly produces numbers. One of the key numbers that they provide is the relationship of federal debt held by the public. Now, this is not, yes, this is federal debt held by the public as a percentage of annual gross domestic product. And this is typically a measure that has been used worldwide. This was, for instance, the measure that the European Bank and the Euro zone used to push on Greece when their debt situation sort of spiraled out of control a number of years ago. The highest that the United States has ever gone was during World War II, and it went slightly above 100% of current gross domestic product. Note where we are today is extremely close to that 100% number, and that in fact on our current glide path, by, as is noted here, by 2052, Congressional Budget Office is projecting that we would see a federal debt equal to 185% of gross domestic product. That's without any additional tax cuts. That's without any additional incentives. That's just today's statute. That's just today's bottom line. And clearly, I mean, part of this is a result of what we've gone through with respect to the recent pandemic. We see here, and I need to give some credit here to the folks over at Tax Notes who did put these numbers together, pulled them together from the Congressional Budget Office. These are all Congressional Budget Office numbers still, that show the glide path a little bit, just to, for those of you who are very visual, we've essentially rotated. So now as we go down, it gets worse, whereas in the prior slide, as it went up, we got worse. But we can see what the projection of the current projection is of the federal deficit as a percentage of gross domestic product. And this is, what the change there is coming. This is the annual contribution to the deficit. And you can see the little dotted blue line was this, that was when we thought that the coronavirus situation was going to be better contained, that in fact turned out to be. And then the hard red line is the projection that Congressional Budget Office is using now. But as you can see, other than the significant dips of the Great Recession and the actual spending during the pandemic period, we are reaching higher and higher contributions to this overall deficit than has been the case. And as a result, the more you borrow, the more interest you pay. Keep in mind and in fact, the Congressional Budget Office interest projection, I don't believe I have that slide, but again, it's not quite what we have seen in the last month. But again, as you can see, the interest costs are rising, and this should not be a surprise to anyone. The Congress, America pumped $5.8 trillion of additional deficit in order to try and keep the economy rolling during the coronavirus period. Add to that the additional interest costs, and that's what you're seeing here. Not even the total, but just with the difference between the blue and the red line, just of the additional amounts as to how that has now is factoring in, and the contribution that interest is making to the overall deficit. All right, so let's go on to one. Well, all right, here's where you can see here. Dark purple is actual spending outlays. Light purple is net interest outlays. The more you borrow, the more interest you pay. We're in a deficit position now. The deficit position gets worse in part because of ongoing interest. It's simply going to be extremely difficult to do what we've come used to, which is to say, we've gotten used to over the last really 20 years, 22, that really since the time of the second Bush administration, tax legislation meant tax cuts. If we're going to go into tax legislation, we're going to provide some great new incentives for necessarily very positive things. We're going to provide some additional spending to try and address some of the other issues that we find in society. And as the dark purple grows, so must the light purple. And the percentage to the GDP deficit that we are adding each year grows and grows and grows. Now,
hey,
someone like to say, yeah, please, Jay.
So I just want to make an ad. The reconciliation that I've talked about, this bill, those rules were established in 1974. They were established to combat inflation. What the government was trying to say was, we are spending way too much money on interest. We need to raise revenue to combat this interest. And so we're going to make it easier for the Senate to pass a revenue raising bill. Reconciliation was always supposed to be about revenue raising, not revenue cutting. And so, and it all gave birth from the inflation. And back when George W. Bush did the reconciliation bill in 2001 that cut taxes, the argument was, we don't have inflation anymore, so we don't need to deal with it. So let's use reconciliation to help the economy, because it used to help the economy by dealing with inflation. So now we're kind of back to where we were 50 years ago. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
And not a very specific difference from where we were, certainly where we were 20 years ago when George W. Bush put through the 2001 Tax Reform Act, Tax Reduction Act. That is the one place where you see the dark purple above the zero line were the 4 years essentially leading up to that legislation. And at that point in time, the projections were, we're going to have surplus as far as the eye can see. There were people talking, if you think back to that day, those of you who are old enough like Jay and I, particularly me, I don't want to throw Jay under the bus there. But people were talking about, well, what is the government going to do with all this money that it's collected? What are they going to do with this surplus? Are we going to, maybe the government should, right back then, IBM, the lawsuit over IBM's monopolistic practices was still going on. I mean, people were suggesting, well, we'll just buy out IBM. That'll solve that will solve the antitrust issue there. And in speaking with a couple of the very senior economists that were working for Congress at that point in time, both of them said, look, this is real. We have this surplus. We don't really know where it came from. And that's scary because we're not going to know when it goes away.
Right.
And while people sometimes say, well, there was too big a tax cut in 2001, in fact, all they were doing was trying to return half of what the projected surplus was back to the taxpayers.
Yeah,
one
senator called what we're giving back a mountain. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. We're giving back a molehill. You guys are making it a mountain.
Right.
They were doing very little of that. It wasn't the full surplus. You're absolutely right.
Unfortunately, it turned out that the people that I talked to on congressional staff were right. They didn't know where the surplus had come from, and they did not really know when and why it was going to go away.
Also, the CBO just said that the current estimate for CBO, they don't know where the extra revenue is coming from again. We are literally repeating history. It is,
that is always the case. Now that does lead us to, and given what Jay and I have just said, okay, the economists don't know. So what if they've got it wrong? What if it's not this bad? Okay, well, one nice thing about economists is they're very, very good at running numbers. And they run lots of numbers, sometimes trying to dispute what another economist has said. And one of the things that the Congressional Budget Office does is they do a study on what the likelihood is for the particular outcome that they've projected. And here you can see the little spray here. Yeah, it is not necessarily as bad. Will not necessarily be as bad as CBO projects. On the other hand, it could also be worse. And in fact, excuse me, we do know that if you consult some of the independent economists, the people who work for the large banks, the people who work for some of the larger investment funds, they are already below the CBO's line. There seems to be a consensus, not uniformity, but at least a consensus that the CBO is being a little bit on the optimistic side with regard to both their projections of the total deficit and also their projections of how much GDP we're going to have. And in fact, the less GDP we have, the worse the line on the previous slide is actually going to look. Okay, so now we've had enough of graphs, enough of the dismal science here. What does this mean? Well, I think we may need to begin to move into an area. Senator Manchin, because his concerns over the deficit, along with some other Democratic senators who have been less voluble about it, is a lot of the reason that Build Back Better did not move forward. Build Back Better was an expensive bill. And Manchin said, look, we need to start thinking again about paying for this. Are we at that point? Do provisions, including the extenders, including the 163J, including the R&E amortization fix, are they now going to have to be paid for? And if they're going to have to be paid for, even if they're not paid for, is the glide path, and remember that was the glide path, that doesn't include any of these fixes we're talking about, is that going to ultimately create a situation where government revenues are going to have to be raised through tax increases? Is it going to happen this year? Jay has given us tons of reasons why it's not. Is it going to happen in 2023? I think Jay has given us some good reasons why it's probably not. 2024 is going to be potentially a very watershed presidential election. It makes it highly doubtful. But once we get past 2024, what are we going to do? How are we going to fight inflation in the meantime? The traditional way of fighting inflation is really to try and cause a short-term recession. And if you look at, the Fed has already taken the rates up 3/4 of a point. They're talking about additional half-point increases several times, potentially the rest of the year. Do we fight inflation the traditional way, which seems to be we force a short-term recession? And certainly in a period of short-term recession, we're not going to be eager about raising taxes. What we're going to be looking to do, what Congress is going to be looking to do, is to offset the pain of the monetarists over at the Fed with the fiscal changes that Congress itself can accomplish. Let me throw in one more concern, and that is, what are we going to do about Social Security? What are we going to do about Medicare? Right now, Congressional Budget Office projects that the Medicare Trust Fund is going to be depleted, not drawn down, depleted in 2030. And the Social Security Trust Fund depleted in 2033. And again, as we've discussed, CBO is maybe a little on the optimistic side compared to what we're seeing from other economists. This is going to require, this is not something one party can address. We're going to have some level of compromise, comity in order to move that forward. We don't see that now. I think it's unlikely we're going to see that in the next couple of years. But we are facing now a situation where the way we have approached tax legislation really now for the last 22 years may not be the way that we can approach tax legislation going substantially forward. I'm going to, I think, stop on that enormously positive note. Any questions that anyone has, please feel free to send them either directly to Jay or I, or to post them in Q&A. We'll stay here for a couple of minutes. Jay, you've got a couple of comments you'd like to throw to the group at the end here?
I do. When we're talking about, when Mel was talking about how, will Republicans write a bill that President Biden might sign? It reminds me of when the Bush tax cuts were extended in 2010 for 2 years. President Obama signed that bill into law, and he campaigned against those tax cuts his whole entire campaign, but yet he understood what was going on economically and said, I need to do this. So he swallowed hard and signed those measures, extending them into law for 2 full years. And I think that we might be faced with a similar situation when it comes to Biden. Biden's not a progressive Democrat at all. I was a reporter. I used to speak with him, and he would speak positively about tax cuts. So the idea that a Republican Congress can write a bill that Biden would sign is doable. And both sides could be happy with that. And if this recession happens, if inflation keeps going, it might be the way that they would go for anyway. But the other thing I'd have to say is, once 2024 hits, it's all going to be about that election and what happens to the tax reform bill in 2025, and if it gets extended or not. That's going to be a really big fight, and it's really going to depend on who controls Congress and the White House when that happens. And that's a fight for down the road. But Republicans are going to start working on that bill next year if they get control of Congress. That's all I got.
No, I think that sums it up very well. Jay, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to turn things back over to Amy to close it out. And again, if you have any questions, or have concerns, or just want to have something you want Jay and I to hear, please go ahead and shoot us an email. I think that's probably the most reliable way of reaching both of us.